much for this opportunity for presenting our work. So today, what I want to do is I want to talk to you about how storytelling can be used to document lost histories in South Asia. And the specific history that I'm going to be focusing on is the partition of 1947. In the spirit of storytelling, let me start by giving you a small background, a little story about where I come from and my early life and how I got this American accent. It's all related to partition. So I was born in Delhi into a military family, and the early years of my life were spent in Kashmir and Leh and Ladakh because that's where my dad was posted. So my earliest memories are of vegetable shopping with my mom on Dal Lake in a shikara, or living in a tin hut in Ladakh, because in those days that's how the army officers lived, in little tin huts. And then spending all of my summers in a little town called Faridkot in Punjab, where my maternal grandparents lived. Now, Faridkot is very, very close to the border with Pakistan. So we used to get 2 TV channels, whereas most people in India in the 1980s only got 1, which was Doordarshan. So I grew up watching Benazir Bhutto, and also I grew up watching Indira Gandhi on TV. At that time in the 1980s, in Punjab, there was also a lot of civil unrest going on. So at night, when we were going to sleep, we would hear stories about all the different cultural aspects of Punjab, all of the kings and queens. But we would also hear stories about different neighbors disappearing. And we would hear stories about, I would hear my family being paranoid that we were being labeled as terrorists. I come from a Sikh family. And so I used to think as a kid, actually, I don't really feel like we're terrorists. I think we're pretty normal. And I wish the other side would, hear our side of the story too. And so those are the kinds of things that, the kind of atmosphere that I grew up in. And then eventually, as a lot of Punjabi families did in the 1980s, due to the insecurities of that time, we left India. In my case, my dad's brother was well settled in the US. He got his PhD there in the 1950s. And so we went and joined him in the US. So at the age of 10, I became an Indian American, a diaspora, and I gained this accent. When I was growing up with those stories as a kid, I had also learned that my father's side of the family had come from the other side. And we used to go to the fence, which is now the big, elaborate Wagah border. At that time, it was just a fence to go look at the other side. It was very close to where we lived. And I knew the stories that my grandmother had told me about how disturbing it was, how there was so much violence and millions of people were impacted. Yet, in school, both in India and then later when I went to the US, it was not even mentioned that all of this happened. I usually learned in my American textbooks, I think there was just one line that Gandhi led a peaceful march, and there was a transition of power, everything was fine, completely nonviolent, and voila, India and Pakistan were born. But this story, there was a big contrast between folk history and official history, and that bothered me a lot growing up. This slide just basically shows, how the British departed in 1947 when they could no longer sustain the freedom struggles. They could no longer, oppress the freedom struggles that were going on in South Asia due to their own post-World War deficit. And so, just to give you a little background, which you probably already know, as the British were leaving in 1947, we have, this Radcliffe Line, which it's been talked about a lot more recently, so you've probably heard of it, where more than 500 kingdoms, princely states, however you want to look at it in the modern context, were merged with British-occupied territories, which they called India. So India is not actually even a native term. When you dig into this history, you start to learn that, and it's really fascinating, actually. And so they combined these states with British-occupied territories, which were India, British India, and they divided the states of Punjab and Bengal into modern India and Pakistan. Well, at that time, it was East and West Pakistan, which, as you know, East Pakistan in 1971 became Bangladesh. So, what was curious about this event was that if you look at the numbers, they're absolutely astonishing. Nearly 1% of the world's people, or 1 in 100 people, became homeless at that time. So this is starting in around 1945, when the unrest began, up until like the next 10 years, because people kept moving. And then you have, if you look at all of South Asia, so when we think of partition, we think, okay, it was Punjab, there was some violence, a little bit happened in Bengal. Actually, what we're finding, that's not true. In fact, the violence and the movement occurred all over the subcontinent, all the way from Kashmir, down to Tamil Nadu, down to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, in fact, and all the way from Afghanistan to Burma. And so if you look at most of South Asia being impacted, you see that it was nearly 1 in 8 people that were impacted by partition. And yet, we had events of this scale that occurred around the same time that were very well documented. So imagine for a second if the Holocaust, we didn't have the witness voices, or Hiroshima, Nagasaki, if we didn't have the stories, we wouldn't have the UNHCR today. We would not have known about the impacts of the atomic bomb. The nuclear non-proliferation movements started because of what we know from Hiroshima. We know about dictatorships gone wrong because of what we learned from Germany. So in my case, this gap in the history was a huge issue in my mind that I had been thinking about since I was a child. And finally, I could put 2 and 2 together when, during the end of my PhD, I was doing some research in Japan. I took a trip down to Hiroshima. I visited the Peace Memorial. That's one of the few buildings that they've preserved from the time of the atomic bombing, and you can still see it, and they've converted it into a peace memorial. And there they have an oral history archive, which is incredibly moving. For me, I had, in American high schools, they require you to spend a lot of time studying the atomic bomb. You watch movies, you read a bunch of books, and you kind of know it's a bad thing, but you don't really feel it until you hear the voices of the survivors. Because when you hear it directly from the survivors, there's not just, their words. You see there's more communication going on. I think, people have studied this, and they've said like 97% of the communication happens non-verbally. So you can see their facial expressions, you can see their body language. Not only that, but you hear their stories. Like a lot of them couldn't marry or get jobs, even if they survived the atomic bombing, because they were considered contaminated. So I couldn't even imagine, you've survived this massive thing, and then you're kind of dead in a way in society for the rest of your life. And so I was very, very deeply moved and disturbed, and I realized in that moment that when you hear it directly from the survivor, there's nothing as powerful as that, and you can't forget that history. So I realized people needed to hear these stories from those who had experienced them. My grandparents were long gone already, but there were millions of other people whose grandparents were still around. And the problem was that people who witnessed partition were all over the world. They were in their 80s and above, if they were young adults at that time. And how do we get to them? So I was at the UC Berkeley physics department at that time, and this new concept of crowdsourcing had come about. And crowdsourcing, they used it in the context of protein folding. So protein folding is this very difficult problem that our computers cannot solve. However, what they did is physicists there broke it up into little tiny bits, and they sent it to thousands of people as screensavers. And people, our brains, thankfully, can still do some calculations that computers cannot. And so in this way, they were able to solve this problem. The community came together, and they termed this crowdsourcing. A more ancient version of this is this painting. It's called Building a Rainbow, where millions of little stick figures are coming together to build something far greater than themselves. And so I really liked the concept, and I thought, okay, well, how can we apply this to this problem of getting to these millions of people whose stories have not been told, and this history is almost dead, yet it impacted us so immensely. And let me talk about that for 1 second. So these days, there's been a lot of work, there is starting to be a lot of work on the psychological impacts of partition. We know from the Holocaust and other events that there are actually epigenetic changes that occur in people who have experienced this sort of trauma. So it lives in our genes. It gives us, it impacts what genes are expressed in the offspring. In addition, there's also PTSD, and it takes generations for the impacts of PTSD to go away because it keeps passing down from one generation to next. And so if you think about millions of people being impacted with this, we haven't had that self-realization to understand a lot of our social problems today here in India. So we decided to use this concept of crowdsourcing. In 2013, I left my career at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and UC Berkeley in California. I had a PhD in physics at that point. I was doing condensed matter research, but I had started doing this work on the side. So in 2010, just to backtrack for 1 second, I had felt this immense urgency that people were leaving us, they were dying, and they were taking their stories with them. This was triggered by one of my family members who was, he was in his late 90s and the only person in my family who had partition era stories. And he had told me that I should bring my camera with him the next time I visit him so that I could record his story, but there was no next time because he passed away after he told me that. And I just felt this immense, not only guilt that, and sadness that I had lost a family member, but also that he took this lifetime of knowledge with him, and there was no other record of that knowledge. And I thought about all the other people that were still out there. And so I had set up, I just kind of wanted to do something, anything, and I went to mosques and temples and gurdwaras in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I lived, and that seemed to be, the simplest thing to do at that time. I set up a table, and it just said stories from 47, and the first day I did this, more than 30 people lined up, and I was like, wow, there's no way I can record your stories by myself, so clearly we need to get help. And so I started recruiting a lot of volunteers, and by 2013, this had become a big enough effort of volunteers in the Bay Area where my house had turned into this like 24/7 place where people would donate cameras and then come and borrow cameras. Everybody was like volunteering, borrowing cameras, recording stories in the community. It turned into this center. And then somebody handed us a check and they said, here's a check for $194.70. You clearly need resources. Who do I make it out to? And I said, oh, I don't know. Like, we don't have a name. And so that's how a bunch of us came together, and we gave it this name that's probably kind of boring, 1947 Partition Archive. So that's how the name came about, but I guess it's very descriptive. And this was the mission that we came up with, to document, preserve, and share eyewitness accounts from all ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic communities impacted by the partition of British India. So the reason we worded it like that is something that I discovered working with the South Asian community, a memory that had disappeared from having grown up in the US, is that there's still a lot of segregation around community lines here. And so when I would go record stories in the very early days, so I'm obviously Punjabi Sikh background, I would go to somebody who was Sindhi or somebody who is Pakistani from, say, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. They'd be like, well, why are you interested in my community's stories? And I never thought about it that way. I was like, oh, well, you were impacted by partition, so it's part of the story, it's part of the bigger picture. But anyway, eventually people got used to it, that this platform existed for everyone who was impacted by partition, and we put it into our mission statement. And the people who were recording stories through this crowdsourcing process, we labeled them citizen historians. I didn't come up with this term, some of the volunteers did. And then for areas where people didn't have access to technology, like villages or maybe economically challenged areas, we launched a scholarship program that was competitive and merit-based, and it's called the Story Scholars Program. And that's how we covered stories, started recording stories in a lot of these different areas. So crowdsourcing, just to go back to that slide, not only enabled us to do this work in a fast way, in that we had global reach with the use of technology, but we could do it in a frugal way. So usually oral history projects are very, very expensive. You need a lot of equipment, you have to do a lot of paperwork. But by crowdsourcing it, we were able to minimize that cost. And we also were able to spread these stories now in the community. So when somebody recorded a story, what the grandchildren in that family would see is like, oh wow, my grandparents' story is kind of important because people are here to record it. So then they would start talking about it, and then our volunteers would talk about it in the community, and the story would start to spread organically outside of the organization and what we were doing. And there's a lot of empathy building that happens with stories. So this is just an image of when we first started this work. This is, I think, 2011 or 2012. That's myself and another person. We came to Amritsar. We wanted to see what it would be like to run our scholarship program before we launched it. And we went from shop to shop in the walled city. And we had an incredible experience. So some of these shops were like 300 years old. They'd been in the same family. These are little hidden histories, little tiny shops you would never expect that from, but massive histories. In California and the US, which is where I was based at the time, we went from event to event trying to document these stories. So just to give you a glimpse of how this works, we would teach these free workshops, and 7 years later, we're still teaching them every other week. These free online workshops, people log in, they learn how to record these stories. In those days, smartphones were not as good. This is like 7 years ago. So people were using video cameras, but now anyone, it's more accessible. People can use their smartphones, record these stories. They upload them to our servers, and then those get spread on social media and inspires even more people to record these stories. So this is just to give you a visual glimpse. Stories are coming in from all over the world, going into the digital cloud. So our goal initially was, can we capture at least 10,000 people's stories given the number of people that were impacted? And so I'm really excited to say that in this way, even though it was a massive struggle, we've been able to record 9,000, a little bit over 9,000 as of last week. Thank you. More than 600 people have volunteered to do this work. So each story takes, on average, 14 hours of volunteer work to record. They've come together from 12 countries in more than 450 cities and villages. The stories have come in 36 languages and dialects, so we don't want to leave anybody out. And we have more than 1 million people following these stories on social media, and I think last year alone there were like 20 million shares of these stories, so the soft power of sharing these stories is making an impact that we maybe can't even measure that directly. And so the cost of this work, as I said, the financial cost has been minimal. So it's been about 1.2 lakh volunteer hours and about $2 million in US dollars completely crowdsourced on mostly small ticket donations, which was quite a challenge in itself. So if you go to our website, you'll see this map. You can click on any city and you'll see stories from that city. If there's a video uploaded, you can see video or you can read about the person. And we've collaborated now with Stanford University in California. They have a digital repository. The reason we did this is we can then make it available for the rest of the world. Of course, we could have done that on YouTube, and we still are doing that. However, by putting it in a university's archive, it also gets a catalog number. So now it can be cited by scholars more easily. And also, these stories are not just any stories. These are actual oral histories of trauma, of a conflict, time of conflict. And there's a lot that can potentially go wrong. And by the way, we're partnering with Tata Trusts. I have to thank them for being bold and supporting this wild idea on this particular project. And so we have to move forward with care. And who are the best people to give it that care? It's people who have that professional experience. These are scholars who have worked in this area for maybe 30 years, and usually professors at universities. So that's what we're doing. We're working with a group of 15 scholars on how to bring these out. We're piloting this project at 3 universities in India and 2 in Pakistan, and those are labeled here. So the archive is already in use. There's a number of museums that have exhibits, permanent exhibits based on the archive stories. One right here in India at the Virasat-e Khalsa Museum in Anandpur Sahib. Also, there are quite a few films at this point that have used the stories. Bhag Milkha Bhag, I think, they had referenced a number of the stories in the archive, and they were making certain scenes, and I've heard the same about Bharat that just came out recently. And then you have documentaries, like the BBC one that came out 2 years ago, and that one as well. We worked on it a lot with their team to bring out a lot of those stories featured in that documentary. In addition, before we go into the learnings, I want to say our whole point is to make this archive completely open and public. and we're working on that. It's a very expensive project, but we're working on that in collaboration with Stanford and others. So here are just glimpses of some learnings. So Sundarbans, who would have thought that the Sundarbans was impacted by partition? So this man that we interviewed, that you see up here, he was 108 years old. And when we went to interview him, it was quite a fascinating experience for me. The Sundarbans are just an incredible place. There were literally snakes on the ground around his hut. But the important thing is that what we learned from this story is the impact of partition ecologically and on people. So what he noted to us was that a lot of people who were settled in the Sundarbans at the time of partition, I think over 1 million people, they were settled in parts of the Sundarbans that even the native population who are indigenous to the area would not live in because they're so low-lying. And now with the rising sea levels, these areas are going underwater permanently. And so you have your first climate refugees in India coming out of the Sundarbans, and they're actually partition refugees who were settled there. In addition, you have this tiger widow problem that's happened, that has a lot of political implications too. It's because a lot of people who were settled there, they didn't have that culture of dealing with the wildlife. They were not from there originally, and hence a lot of women lost their husbands to these tiger attacks and have no other way of earning income. This is just an image of me with some of the tiger widows. So another interesting glimpse, and like I said, there's 9,000 stories. I'm just going to give you 3 or 4 glimpses. So this gentleman, he was 107 when we interviewed him, and he told us something really interesting, that he, to this day, would not drink chai. He was boycotting chai. And I always thought chai was a staple Indian, South Asian drink. And what he told me is that it wasn't, that actually he claimed, I have not verified this, but he claimed that the British East India Company used to come around and spike people's milk, and so to get them addicted to chai. So he would not drink chai as a way to protest the British East India Company to this day. We also had a lot of musical gharanas that were impacted by partition that were split up. And so partition had a massive impact on the arts, everything from music to handicrafts and native arts, and also knowledge. There's so many libraries of one-of-a-kind books that went up in flames at that time. We also see from census data, actually, on that point, that you see the education levels drop in the subcontinent initially after partition, and then, of course, they rise again after about a 10-year gap. We are also getting really rare languages into the archive, like Torwali, that this gentleman spoke from the Northwest Frontier area. Then you have some stories that are not so common, like this gentleman who belongs to an ancient South Asian Jewish community. And in 1947, I think they migrated from either Karachi or Lahore over to Pune. And then from Pune, they were recruited in 1948 by the Builders Movement in Israel. And so they all migrated to Israel to go and help. They migrated without their parents, all the young boys from Jewish families in Pune, to go help build Israel. And then a lot of them, especially those of South Asian origin, felt discriminated in Israel after a few years, or a few decades maybe, and they eventually migrated to places like New York. And this is Erin Riggs on our team, who actually ended up doing her PhD research with us, who interviewed this gentleman in New York. You also learn about the importance of the so-called princely states, which we don't think about as much today, but when you're listening to individual stories, especially of those people who came from the princely states, you get a completely different glimpse of South Asian history than what I see in pop culture today. And so for our kind of work, where you're getting the history from lived experiences, it becomes really important to not ignore this. One of our first research projects, our own, into the archive, there's a lot of third-party research projects, is about the origin of violence. And what we find is absolutely fascinating because it doesn't coincide with the popular story of neighbors started killing neighbors. In fact, we find that less than 2% of the people at that time were involved in the violence. And a lot of the violence, the way it unfolded, you can now compare the situation that was there, present at that time at the subcontinent, to what happened in Sierra Leone, what happened in Rwanda, what happens in a lot of places when a couple of elements come together. One, when you have a very fast transition to democracy, which we did. We had a very sudden transition to democracy. So it leads to a power grab and a creation of constituencies. Two, when you have economic groups, when you have different groups, you can define them by religion, you can define them by skin color, you can define them however you want, but if there's an economic and political representation disparity between those groups. And three, if you have soldiers who are freshly returning from war. In this case, we had thousands and thousands of soldiers returning from World War II, having been away for like 10 years and still living their trauma. So these elements, when they come together, they can lead to the kind of mass violence we saw in the subcontinent. So it wasn't just that something wrong, something went wrong in our minds and we went crazy. It's that the situation that occurred at that time has occurred in other places throughout human history and has led to the same sort of violence and consequences. And that's something we need to understand better. I think that I mentioned this already, but one of the cool things about doing the crowdsourcing is that the stories then start propagating within the families and communities as well. And so you get this grassroots growing of history. And in our case, because of the use of social media, we've also had a lot of separated families that have reunited through our social media pages after their stories are posted, or long lost friends as well. At the moment, we have an exhibit going on at the Mundy House metro station. In case any of you guys are in Delhi, you can stop by. It was supposed to end last month, but they've extended it for a couple more. So you can drop in. It's a very, very simple exhibit. It just kind of gives you a brief glimpse into the archive. And so this resource is built for you. You can also help build it. And what we want to do in the future is we do want to build more physical exhibits, more immersive exhibits. And I think the opportunity that we have with Partition, like with the Holocaust, we learned about dictatorships. With Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we learned about nuclear war. I think with Partition, we have a global opportunity to dig into communal violence, which is still an issue today. And the cost of conflict is really high. Peace and development go hand in hand. That peace is missing right now from the equation, I think, in a big way. And so I think that's something that we need to look into more. So thank you.
One is, have you got any links with the Partition Museum in Amritsar? And second one is, were they reluctant to sort of recall the memories? Did you find people not wanting to talk about it because they'd been through trauma, and then when you convinced them to talk about it, they felt differently?
Yeah, so in some cases, people are not wanting to talk about it, and they need a little bit of encouragement, and we do give them that. But if they're absolutely not wanting to talk about it, we will never force anybody. So we'll always, it's their option if they want to talk about it. But if they need that encouragement, so we train our volunteers on this, if they need that encouragement, we'll definitely provide them that encouragement and that safe space. So in our release forms, we offer a lot of possibilities. They can keep the stories completely non-public and make them only available for research if they want. They can seal their story for up to 50 years if they want, if they don't want next generations to find out. And a lot of people who've committed violent acts at that time and want to talk about them, they want to tell the world, like, this is what happened to me, I became violent. They do have us seal their stories for maybe 50 to 100 years because they don't want it to be out anytime soon. I missed your first question.
This was about the Partition Museum in Amritsar.
What about them?
There is a Partition Museum in Amritsar. Do you have any links with them?
We don't have links. We've had conversations, but they are a much newer project. So they started in 2017. I've been there, but we aren't collaborating at the moment. No.
It's a very relevant in today's India, as present India. You're keeping your stories and everything and explaining that during the partition, what trauma one went through just because of religious hatred. It's very relevant. How can it be used today to bring the peace between the communities? Because
Absolutely.
Today, again, that situation is there at least in India. So how your stories can support to bring the peace within the communities?
I think empathy building is the opportunity we have here. I think I was trying to get to that point. I might have missed saying it earlier. But I think the big opportunity we have here is empathy building and really digging into communal violence and helping people self-reflect and having that metacognition and teaching people how to think critically and showing them the stories of the other side. Hey, it's actually like the same story.
Hi, just wanted to understand what kind of offline opportunities you get to engage with younger people. And if so, what kind of a response do you find from them to, in terms of understanding their histories?
Yeah, absolutely. So we offer a lot of volunteer positions, the obvious one being the citizen historians, where they can record stories. But we have a lot of other internships as well, everything from digital archiving to social media and so on. And what we find is that we have an overwhelming number of applicants and we don't have the staff capacity to take on as many volunteers as, as people are interested. And yes, I've seen a lot of transformation in people in terms of how their viewpoints change once they start hearing histories from all these different sides.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. These lessons you've learned specially, do you think they could feed into policy in any way for, communities that are getting displaced within India for projects? Or because you said some of the trauma is epigenetic, then you said there are certain conditions to violence. So, do you?
Absolutely, 100%. I think there's a lot to learn from how, because we have maybe 3 generations now of data, basically how, when people were displaced, how they settled, how they overcame their traumas or not. Because we've heard of a lot of people who simply died of shock. They're not around to tell their stories. The sample set we have are people who actually overcame their trauma today, right? So yeah, I think there's a huge amount of learning that can happen there, especially on other displaced communities as well.
Thank you so much, Guneeta. Thank you. That was so beautiful. Please give her a big round of applause.